Welcome to the webinar series of the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford University. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you are well. My name is Karen Eggleston, and I serve as Deputy Director of the Asia Pacific Research Center. And before turning it over to Dr. Arzan Terapur to introduce today's distinguished speakers, I want to share with you an overview of our webinar series on Asian politics in policy in a time of uncertainty. At our website, you can find recordings of previous events and links to register for forthcoming ones, which include next week, the third era of Abenomics reviewed, and on February 16th is Indonesian Democracy in Decline. On March 2nd, Demographics and Innovation in Asia. And finally, on March 9th, the Political Economy of E-commerce in China. We welcome you to join us for any of those. And now for today's webinar, co-sponsored by the Center for South Asia, I turn it over to Arzan.
Thank you very much, Karen, and welcome everybody out there. Good morning, good evening, good very early morning, depending on where you are. And welcome to our first South Asia event for 2021. Today, we focus on Pakistan. Now, in places like Washington, D.C. in recent years, Pakistan has too often been just an appendage or a hyphenated part of a broader issue. Today, mostly it's the Afghanistan peace process and the extent to which Pakistan can help the US extricate itself and support a durable arrangement. Or otherwise, Pakistan is sometimes an extension of the wider China issue from the US perspective, or it's a rival of India. But in fact, of course, Pakistan is an enormously consequential country in its own right. It's a country of well over 200 million people. It's an multi-ethnic society. It's a nuclear power, and it's a democracy that is constantly under pressure from a range of governance challenges and an extremely powerful army. In fact, as the world right now, this week, the last 48 hours, has been fixated on the military coup at the other end of South Asia, Pakistan has its own history of multiple coups, and even when the army is not openly in charge, it seems to control a lot of the levers of power and policy. So how is it dealing right now with the host of governance and security and economic and environmental and social challenges that Pakistan faces? We have only an hour, so we'll focus only on the sort of handful, let's say 3 top headline issues. We'll talk about the domestic politics and the political opposition to the government of Prime Minister Imran Khan. We'll talk about internal security in Pakistan, and we'll talk about relations with the US, given the new Biden administration in Washington. I am enormously excited to present our 3 experts. I will not read their bios because you can do that. But we have joining us Madiha Afzal, who is a Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institution. We have Rabia Akhtar, who is the Director of the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research at the University of Lahore. And we have Elizabeth Threlkeld, who is a Senior Fellow and the Deputy Director of the South Asia Program at the Stimson Center. We have, as I said, a ton to get through, so let me stop wasting time and make just a last housekeeping announcement. This, like our previous events, will be mostly structured as a Q&A rather than a series of presentations. And I invite you all out there in Zoom land to submit brief, please, questions through the Zoom Q&A function. The chat function is disabled, but use the Q&A function. Bear with me, because time is short, I will be ruthless in picking the questions and I might bundle them and synthesize them. So keep them brief and keep them relevant. With that, let's begin. So let me start perhaps by asking Madiha about the central government, the government of Imran Khan, backed by the army. There is a view that in the last year or 2 or several, the government has become more and more repressive. There are reports of journalists being arrested at an increasing rate. There are reports of books being banned. Is this real? Are we actually seeing a government that is becoming more and more repressive?
Thanks, Arzan, and thanks for inviting me to this discussion and for holding it. On the government's repression, I mean, there's certainly a lot of anecdotal evidence, right? But one has to be careful about anecdotal evidence, especially in an environment where it's easy to talk about anecdotal evidence, that is social media. So it's very easy for that to get a lot of coverage, especially here. A couple of things, and I'll just mention these. There were always red lines. I mean, you know, I wrote a chapter a couple of years ago about the red lines that could not be crossed. And these red lines are enforced, you know, so it's criticism, sort of very, very stringent criticism of the military, let's say, or of, you know, talking about Balochistan in certain terms, for instance. And in some ways, those red lines have actually been crossed this year. If you think about the kind of criticism leveled by Nawaz Sharif at the Pakistan Democratic Movement's rallies in the fall. And so you'll, and I'm sure we'll discuss that. So in some ways, those red lines have been crossed, but of course, Nawaz Sharif is not in Pakistan. He's out of the country. I think, you know, it's useful to look at certain indicators. So if we look at RSF's indicators for press freedom, it's interesting to see where Pakistan falls. And I was just looking at this. Pakistan is 145, number 145 out of 180 countries. India is 142. Afghanistan actually does better on that. Pakistan has fallen a little bit in the past 2 years. So think about from 2018, I think it was number 139. So it's fallen a little bit. But if you go back about 6-7 years, actually, it's further down on that list. So it was a number 159 on that list. So, you know, it's been moving. It's you know, these are not numbers, of course, to be proud of, but in the context of the region and in the context of where it's been, it's hard to argue on a whole that things are moving rapidly downhill. However, you know, there are, as I said, there are certain sort of incidents that you sort of hear about on social media, and those deserve attention because in this kind of case, individual incidents are important in their own right and not necessarily as part of an aggregate. The one other thing I'll say is, you know, there were sort of reports of banned books in Punjab that came out last summer, and the Punjab Curriculum and Textbook Board's management director was, you know, reportedly banned 100 books for anti-Islam content and content that he considered blasphemous, and he was removed the following month after an outcry. So there is also this kind of notion that an outcry on social media, you know, when these incidents are brought up, when there's, you know, a journalist who disappears for a day, if there's enough pushback against it, you know, there's corrective action. So this is not a void into which things disappear. And so the responsiveness is important to note as well.
Right, that's really useful context, actually. And you mentioned a couple of things that I want to pick up on. And Rabia, you're actually there. Of all the panelists, you're the only one who's physically in Pakistan right now. So let me ask you your perspective from what you've seen at a closer proximity. What's your take on this question? And since Madiha brought this up also, what's your view on PDM, its trajectory and the extent to which it has come close to or crossed these red lines?
Thank you so much, Azan, for inviting me to join this very exciting panel. I don't normally do webinars on Pakistan's domestic politics because that's not my primary area of interest. But I'm here today as a regular Pakistani citizen, a middle-class academic who does think about these issues and is affected by domestic politics. The views here today are my own and they don't represent any of my affiliations. I am an incorrigible optimist. I think Pakistan is grossly misunderstood not only by its own people, but also by people, Pakistan watchers outside Pakistan. I think Pakistan will have to go through several reincarnations in order to find its true self. In that process, Pakistan is many things to many people. In that process, it will see the rise and fall of democracy, but will learn from it. In that process, it will see corruption of huge proportions, but will survive. It will see a generation which will learn from its experimentation with military or authoritarian rule enough to know the worth of democracy. It will see a generation which will learn from its proxy experimentation and will say no more. But we aren't there yet. We are getting there. In our attempts to get there, we will continue to make mistakes and will continue to learn. Pakistan, at the end of the day, need not live up to the world's expectations from it, but only its own. We are only in our seventh decade of existence, only seventh. So I would tell the world to let us grow. If Imran Khan works, good. If he fails, even better. We would know what would not work and cross that out of our list. The problem is that while Pakistan is in this process of learning and making mistakes, falling and rising, the world is not letting it breathe. If it were left up to me, there would be a Berlin Wall of sorts around Pakistan where Pakistan would hang the board and say, recess, time out. We aren't available for you. We aren't available for Afghanistan, for the US, for China, or anybody else. Go deal with your own mess. We want to heal, time out. And that the world would leave us alone is probably where my incorrigibility and optimism comes from, but that's not going to happen, is it? So here we are in a webinar which is titled Cornered into Change, with a question mark, thankfully, where an optimist like me can make the statement that this change is not because the world has pushed Pakistan to change, but change is on the horizon because Pakistan is learning from its own mistakes and realizes what is not working for it. Thus, the change is in order. Look at Pakistan's COVID response, 11,000 deaths and counting, but compare that with your country. Moody's Investor Service said Pakistan's long term credit growth potential is strong. GDP growth will accelerate to 4.4% in 2022. This is all part of experimentation. I know it is not perfect, but who wants perfect, right? Who gets that? My one message to the cynics out there is that back off and just let us be. We'll get there at our own pace, but we'll make it one day. Coming to your question today about banning and being repressive towards journalism or media landscape. So some, as Madhya rightly pointed out, some 100 books were banned by the government of Punjab last year for having profane, blasphemous, and anti-Pakistan content in it. They were textbooks, they were taught in schools mainly on account of their violations of the Punjab Curriculum and Textbook Board Act of 2015. As for journalists, Matiullah Jan disappeared for a day. We still don't know the reasons for it. Several journalists and scribes were investigated by the FIA under the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act. They weren't charged. The dissection of media landscape, I believe, in Pakistan has been devoid of nuance. It has obfuscated the concepts of media freedom, journalistic ethics, and responsibility. Also, criminal cases and lawsuits have been dubbed as attacks on freedom of expression. The amounts of criticism of the government, coupled with the plethora of fake news, point to the degree of freedom of the press in Pakistan. Please watch the TV talk shows and read the newspapers. The media, electronic, print, digital, is full of criticism for this government, teaching Imran Khan how to govern Pakistan every single day. This media is anything but repressive. Coming to PDM, last I heard, the PDM led by Maulana Fazlur Rahman wanted to have tea at the GHQ. May I remind you and your audience that historically, unfortunately, it has been our civilian leaders who have gone to the army to unseat their opponents. It has always been the case. Benazir Bhutto went to Pindi, Nawaz Sharif went to Pindi. PDM is no different. This coalition of 11 political parties also wants to go to Pindi to choose their favorite among the 11. All they want the army is to change who their favorite is. January 31st was the day the opposition was to deposit their resignations. Where are those resignations? Who is stopping them from resigning their seats in the assembly? Surely this is not for the love of Pakistan. February 8th are the Senate elections, with opposition already saying that the system is rigged. From what my reading of the whole situation is, the problem opposition has is with the reform approach. Let's see what the reforms are all about. The government's proposed three constitutional amendments. The first is that they want to replace the single transferable vote in Article 59(2) of the Constitution with open vote. The Senate voting process would no longer remain secret. I ask you, how can that be bad? Number two change that they want to bring is by changing Article 63(1)(c) to allow Pakistanis with dual nationalities to contest the elections. Disqualifications this way for membership of parliament would be amended to allow overseas Pakistanis with dual nationalities to contest elections. They would be required to renounce their citizenship of the foreign country before taking the oath to office. I think it's a great step. It's about time. And lastly, they want to include the word Senate in Article 226 of the Constitution so that the elections can be held through open ballot. Who and why would anybody possibly object to that? PMLN and PPP's Charter of Democracy that was signed between Benazir Bhutto and Nawaz Sharif in 2006, its Article 23 stated, to prevent corruption and floor crossing, all votes for the Senate and other indirect seats will be held through open and identified ballots. Why wasn't any constitutional amendment not made to get this done until today? So you tell me, why would these reforms be a problem now? So to me, PDM is an opportunistic politics at best. Today, they are given audience in Pindi. You will see this whole narrative undermining the military will turn on its head. That's my shortest answer to this question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me actually just press you on one thing that you said, or on a couple of things that you said that combine into a question that I have. And after this, Madiha and Elizabeth, if you want to chime in as well, please do so. The question I have is, you said very eloquently that Pakistan is in a long process of learning and change and evolution, as every country is. But let me ask you, the other thing you said was that the 11 parties of PDM want to go to Pindi and ask GHQ to pick their favorite. If that's the case, how much learning have we seen? How much evolution have we seen if it is still the army that, in your own account, is the kingmaker in Pakistani politics? How do you reconcile those two things? Is there change? Is there some evolution within that process? Or is it the case that the army still is the institution that decides who governs Pakistan?
So in the process of evolution, we haven't gotten there yet. So, historically, like I said, it has been that every civilian government has been going to the army to unseat their opponents. And it's still the same case. Like I said, we're only in the 7th decade of our existence. And it's going to take much more time to learn as to what will be the conditions in which democracy will survive without any push or provocation or support from the military. Today, these 11 parties have come together and, have left their differences aside. But at the bottom, at the heart of it, like I said, is not probably the love for Pakistan. It is the love for power, is the love for NRO so that their corruption cases are forgiven or put aside, and they come to power. And if today the military says that, okay, fine, we're not okay with Imran Khan, or we're not going to let pick any of these 11, and who the contenders are. We're still very much stuck in the dynastic politics. So I think that's also part of the evolutionary process. Probably, like I said, we will reach a point in time where generations that are yet to come in Pakistan will say no to dynastic politics. Probably Imran Khan as an experiment is not going to work, or probably he will work, who knows? But it's the process that matters to me. It is, even if it is military today that is seen to be the kingmaker, so let it be. It is all part of this experimentation. And I guess it's too soon in time to say, whether any learning has been done or not. Clearly, no learning, not much learning has taken place. So I think we're well on our way. I know there are faults. I know there have been mistakes made, but the process is important. To me, the destination comes later. It is the journey that matters. It might sound cliched, but that's how I look at it.
No, I mean, I think democracy is all about process, right? The whole central to democracy, central to good governance is process, not the specific policy outcome. Elizabeth, I wanted to ask you, did you, as someone who has served in Pakistan for the US government, and the US government definitely does have a view on its preference for democracy as a generally sound way of governing a country. How do you see this issue of evolution or learning? How much evolution or learning do you see? Or do you see this situation of the army's political power and ability to arbitrate between different political parties as being relatively constant?
Thanks, Arzan. And again, thanks for hosting. This is a refreshing discussion to have, and I'm looking forward to getting into it. I think three things come to mind. So first of all, is very much not a representative of the US government anymore. I think one of the things that the US has struggled with, particularly in Pakistan's case, though not exclusively, is this tension between, as you put it, its preference for democratic governance and the security imperatives that, given the power structures at play in Pakistan, demand dealing with military. And in some cases, given the division of responsibility de facto between the two sides, it is necessary, or at the very least more efficient, to have conversations with folks in GHQ than in the PM's office. That, I think, is going to be an issue to watch going forward in the Biden administration, exactly how Biden and folks in the State Department and in DOD and elsewhere will handle that balance. I think we saw a change between the way that this had been done in the Obama administration, when there was, I think, care taken to engage primarily on the civilian side, at least initially, as well as with GHQ, whereas Trump was more explicit in dealing just with the military, particularly in Afghanistan. So I think that is just a constant tension where you see two key imperatives from the US perspective, and how those balance out. And sometimes it's just driven by how the US weights its own interests with regards to Pakistan. So that's one thing to watch. In terms of this broader question of kind of the seeds of change, again, not being on the ground in Pakistan, I think I'm always aware of that, and that watching things from DC, particularly when we're all locked down and unable to travel, gives a bit of distance. But maybe the positive spin on that is it's a little bit of analytic distance too. And at least from what I've been able to observe over the past few months from DC, I would argue that potentially we are seeing greater demand from different segments of the population in Pakistan for something different, for something beyond the same old dynastic politics. And I would identify this in three very different groups. So the first one is PTI, the loyal PTI followers that have been with the party maybe might have joined back in the major Karachi rally in the early 2010s, not kind of the electables that jumped on board, but really kind of the young generation, middle class that got behind the party and identified something different in it. To that, I would actually, and probably controversially, add PTM, the followers of the Pashtun Tahfuz movement who have come out in protest in kind of these massive numbers that we really haven't seen before in former Fatah and across KP now. You know, there is a sense of agency there and a demand for something different, crossing red lines that we haven't seen previously. And finally, on the other end of the spectrum, adherence to Islamist parties and some of the religious faithful that have come out in really massive shows of street power. Those are obviously very different groups with different beliefs, but I think we see in that the power of social media to organize. You know, this feels a little bit different, at least from my perspective, than kind of the orchestrated protests that we've seen where people have been transported to and from and provided food and everything else. So maybe in that there is the seed of something, but I would agree with Rabia that it hasn't quite coalesced, certainly into what we're seeing these days in the representation of the opposition through PDM.
So this really gets to, and I want to we'll move on from domestic politics shortly, but to wrap this issue up, this really gets to the issue of. Well, the title of this webinar is Cornered into Change, ? Not cornered by external actors, but cornered by internal actors in Pakistan. So the question, and I'd like to pose this to each of the three of you, is to what extent do we think that these forces that you very, I think, nicely and neatly sort of broke down for us, Elizabeth, to what extent do they, plus the sort of zeitgeist of the COVID-19 response, which is again posed this same question as again you alluded to, Elizabeth, of the balance between what we would normatively like of the army being a sort of professional institution versus the effectiveness of the army being the only institution that can effectively organize and orchestrate a response to a national crisis like COVID-19. So when you have this tension between what a democracy normatively should be, but also the exigencies of how to actually govern pragmatically in the midst of a crisis, combined with this political ferment, to what extent, I would ask each of you, do we see 2021 as being different? Can we see this learning or this evolution, as Rabia put it, reaching some sort of inflection point in 2021 where the army or the system writ large is cornered into some sort of change, if not obviously an entirely different paradigm? But is this combination of crises and actors going to elicit some form of change?
This question that you posed kind of nicely brings to bear sort of the thoughts I was having as we were all having this conversation previously, and Rabia and Elizabeth's comments. So a couple of years ago, I wrote a paper that basically argued that Imran Khan's election could be an inflection point for Pakistan's democracy because it gave stability, given his relationship with the military, it gave a certain stability that other previous governments had essentially spent basically putting out fires, right? Putting out the fire of the opposition, which was constantly trying to undermine the government. The sad, I think, thing to me is that despite that stability, we're seeing the same cycle in many ways reemerge. So with the 2019, the fall of 2019, Fazlur Rahman started his protests, and with the PDM, it's sort of political season all over again in Pakistan, as it always is. And so the sitting government spends its entire time, rather than putting in place the sort of long, deep institutional reforms that need to be put in place, deepening the tax base, sort of looking domestically, shoring up industry, increasing productivity. Instead of doing all of that, they're putting out political fires, responding to the opposition's latest provocation, if you will. And so, I think COVID, of course, has only compounded the issue. And so the same thing has been happening over the last year. I would argue that the PDM is not going, in some ways the writing was on the wall when the combination of parties was, Fazlur Rahman and the PPP and the PMLN. And Fazlur Rahman was chosen as the head, right? There's a whole segment of sort of young, progressive Pakistanis who really, was excited about the PDM. And I saw it, in sort of how they talked about it. But I think they discounted what having Fazlur Rahman as the head would do to a movement. And we are seeing some of that optimism completely fizzle out with the latest rally in which Fazlur Rahman and Maryam Nawaz Sharif talked about an sort of the same old pointing fingers at Israel and pointing fingers at India. And I feel like the PDM is in many ways, sort of doomed to fail, and probably was a few months ago with the selection of Fazlur Rahman as head. So I think, and this is, does the army still have confidence in Imran Khan? I think Imran Khan is in some ways the army's best option still, right? So the PMLN, Nawaz Sharif, has burnt bridges in many ways. Unless Shehbaz Sharif wants to break from Nawaz Sharif, sort of definitively, and make a PMLS. I don't really necessarily see the PMLN rising anytime soon. And the PPP, in many ways, after 2013, kind of relegated itself to a party that became a regional party. So it really it's not in a position right now to win Punjab. And so if Imran Khan is still the army's best option, then it makes sense for him to take a posture where his government essentially invests long-term in the country, right? This is hard. I mean, it's, again, easier said than done. In some ways, the 5-year timeframe was a good timeframe. Sitting at the 2.5-year mark, it's harder to do the longer-term stuff. But because, again, in another paper, I documented Pakistan's incumbency disadvantage. Because governments see themselves always, right, being voted out at the next election, it's harder for them to have the incentives to put in place institutional reform, combined with the domestic instability, the political instability. But in any case, at this 2.5-year mark, I think it's as good a time as any to actually put in place some longer term institutional reform and have this be an inflection point in that sense, right? So not necessarily in the sense of, kind of a shoring up of popular sentiment that may do something to this government. That's, I mean, in some ways, the history of Pakistan is that happening constantly, this hawa, these waves of the changing winds of politics. And in some ways, what Pakistan actually needs is stability. Now, it can seem counterintuitive that sort of democratic stability is in some ways guaranteed by the military, but it is in a position where for the next 2.5 years, this is a democratically elected government, and we can talk about the 2018 election, and it had issues, but it's still the democratically elected government that will complete its term in office. And so the question is, in my view, right? We'll sort of, the verdict is still out on that, of course. And in these 2.5 years, what emerges, I think that's what's going to be interesting. What emerges as a potential credible contender that could, be something different even from these three parties. In a parliamentary system, all of that is very difficult, right? But is there a different candidate that emerges? I don't really necessarily see it right now, but I think what these movements can do is sort of invest in some ways in that, rather than toppling the current government.
Right. That's you're joining Rabia's club of the optimist glass half full. Elizabeth?
All right, I don't know where I come down on the optimist pessimist spectrum here. In direct answer to your question, I don't see this coming year as an inflection point. I think it's likely to be more of the same with perhaps a slightly different flavor, as for the reasons that I think Madiha very eloquently outlined. One dynamic that I will be watching for is what happens at the provincial level. I think there have been some provincial central tensions that have been exacerbated by COVID for one, but also have just come into play in terms of PTI's broader agenda, particularly depending on the outcomes of the Senate elections. I think the 18th Amendment is something to watch, and the extent to which devolution of certain areas that was passed over a decade ago is perhaps again up for discussion. We've seen an overall trend towards centralization. And so looking at the extent to which that is going to be able to move forward, I think will be interesting and perhaps telling to watch. It's one thing that COVID has exacerbated in some ways, because health is one of those devolved subjects. And so we saw this play out at the provincial level, where there were certain steps that it was more difficult for the central government and the establishment to take as a result of that overall structure. Those conversations have been ongoing previously, but I will be watching whether it's particularly framed within the context of COVID, if that is to reemerge later on next year. But beyond that, I think fundamentally, to Madiha's point, there's just not really a viable contender that I could see in the opposition that would be an effective challenger. Part of that has to do with the ruling party's continual pursuit of cases under the National Accountability Bureau, which certainly is helping in some ways to divide the opposition. But I think it also just speaks to the lack of upward mobility within political parties. Even though there is certainly provincial level governance, local bodies might or might not happen. We're hearing rumors in KP and Punjab that those could come back, but you don't really see this kind of upward trajectory of rising, younger, potentially really effective politicians coming up from the local and provincial level. And so I think that is one of those underlying structural reforms that could really strengthen the democratic process, and some political parties, were they to undertake those more internal democratic reforms. But obviously there are a whole host of reasons why we haven't seen that as yet.
And Rabia, I want to give you a chance to chime in on this, and if I might burden you with one sort of additional half question which we've received from Zoomland, which is, when we talk about this sort of groundswell of opposition to the government, I wonder, especially, well, either in the sort of grassroots movements or in elite opinion, to what extent do you see any opposition to Pakistan's relationship with China? Now, because you are someone who does look at Pakistan's foreign and security policies, I want to ask you, is the China relationship a politically salient issue at all? Is it a politically contested issue at all? Or is it just something that either there is widespread support for, or just something that never really registers among people's concerns?
So to answer your first question briefly, I would agree with both, some of what Madhya has said and what Elizabeth has said. I don't think 2021 is going to be the year where the inflection point would arrive. I would very much think that this government will complete its 5 years as it should. And as part of the entire experimentation, we still have like 2.5 years to go. There is a lot of domestic unrest about in the rising inflation, and obviously the push that these domestic these opposition is the kind of attention grabbing, what Madiha said, pushing the government to not being able to prioritize certain issues because the opposition is at their case all the time, not giving them much space. But I would very much think that 2023 probably might be the year when Pakistan should look back and say what worked, what did not work. With respect to the China question, I don't see an overall opposition in Pakistan with its relationship with China. It's on a very solid grounding. And anybody who has a good reading of history, irrespective of what political party you belong to, you would see as to what this friendship turned alliance has been all about. And whosoever is going to be in power will not be able to put that aside, put the history of this relationship aside, and bring their criticisms to the fore. With respect to CPEC, yes, there has been a push that that there should have been more transparency about as to what the CPEC projects are all about, what province is getting what share. But those are not some of the things that are going to sort of have create a dent on the overall China question in Pakistan's life, and as to how it drives its relations with this country. So I don't know if I answer it, but I don't see any sort of opposition, a general opposition to the China relations that Pakistan currently has or will have in future, irrespective of whichever party is in power.
Great. No, that absolutely does answer it. Thank you, Rabia. Let's now turn.
If I can just add a word on the China question, I think it's also the narrative on China has been sort of very scrupulously positive from the top. And that has had an impact on people's perceptions of China. That is, again, not to say that sort of what they're seeing on the ground, in terms of CPEC, et cetera, there might not be criticism here or there, but in terms of thinking about the country as a whole, the narrative is scrupulously positive from the top.
Right. No, that's
can I just add? Yeah, the narrative is there, but narrative is based on facts, as the history suggests. So it is not that the narrative has been generated or engineered. It's been based on facts and people to see. Those who are interested in Pakistan's history, do look at it. So I don't think that it has been imposed by the top or put in place, if I understood Madiha's assertion correctly.
Just agree with you on that in terms of the relationship, right? The relationship certainly has been very positive, but one of the things I think, of course, that comes out is questions of China's internal governance, right? And questions that are raised elsewhere in the world about, let's say, the Uyghur issue or others that that are not part of the conversation necessarily in Pakistan.
Right, and I think it's a fair point that look, that China has for decades been a big supporter of Pakistan. But nevertheless, as we've seen, not just in Pakistan, but in many countries, in every country, the tone and the narrative that the leadership sets has an impact on how people think and behave. And certainly when people say that the Uyghur issue is not an issue, or however it's phrased, it probably does help to marginalize certain issues that could otherwise be provocative. But let's move on. Let's move on to internal security briefly. We don't have a whole lot of time left, so I just want to pose one or two questions on this issue. It's a very timely issue because the last couple of weeks we have seen a couple of newsworthy events. I think there was a piece in the Washington Post today or yesterday about Omar Saeed Sheikh being acquitted and on his way to being released. So let me start with you, Rabia, and then maybe each of you, Elizabeth and Madiha, on this issue of internal security. What does Omar Saeed Sheikh's release or journey towards release say about how the Pakistani state as a whole, noting that this is a judicial decision, treat the internal security challenge that it faces? And if you could, also juxtapose this with the other newsworthy event a couple of weeks ago, which was the arrest and I believe also sentencing of Lakvi. How do you sort of reconcile those two moves? To what extent are they portents or significant indicators of Pakistan's trajectory in internal security?
All right, so I'll start with Lakvi first. So he was arrested on December 7, 2008. He was formally charged by the Anti-Terrorism Court on November 25th, 2009. Though he was granted bail in 2014, he remained in detention till April of 2015, owing to interventions of the government of Pakistan, High Court and Supreme Court. Pakistan's FIA went as far as appealing against the bail. Legal loopholes and weak evidence was presented in the court, which led to his bail. So Pakistan as a sovereign country cannot be expected to bypass its own processes and cover at the behest of another country, whether be it India or anybody else. This is a valid point, especially when India has a lot to answer in terms of the Samjhota Express carnage. Coming to the Umar Said Sheikh decision, I'm personally very disappointed by that decision. But what more evidence does one need of the independence of judiciary than this Supreme Court decision to acquit Umar Said Sheikh? Mind you, not a Pakistani, but a British national, at a time which is absolutely so critical for Pakistan, given FATF's meeting, which is around the corner. An appeal has been made by the Sindh government and the federal government to the Supreme Court to revise their decision, but let's see. So overall, you know, it's there are no easy answers there. Um, if our legal system was geared up, if the loopholes did not exist, if weak evidence was not presented, probably we would have seen better, responses to, what when Lakvi was arrested earlier and then released on bail, we wouldn't have seen that. But with respect to Umar Said Sheikh, although the commentary on it says that there is not much hope with this review, but let's see, but this does talk about independence of judiciary, irrespective of, how disappointing this decision has been.
I'll just add or just speak to the Umar Said Sheikh decision. I think the timing of that decision, right, could not have been worse for Pakistan when it also looks to the start of its relationship with the Biden administration. I mean, it came a day before the first phone call between Secretary Blinken and Foreign Minister Qureshi, and then the juxtaposition, right, of that call, the readout of that call from Secretary Blinken with the call that he had with the his Indian counterpart could not be more stark. And Pakistan, does not want that, right? So Pakistan has, in my view, been very, somewhat apprehensive, yet also optimistic and hopeful that its relationship with the Biden administration would not be returning to status quo ante, right? Returning to the relationship of 2016. But that first tweet, right, or that first readout and that first phone call, and the fact that the first mention of Pakistan in the Biden administration was one where the White House said it was outraged by this decision, is not something Pakistan would have wanted. So yes, so I would say that the timing of this, does speak to the fact that this was a decision that the Supreme Court took. Right, the Pakistan's judiciary has had its ups and downs with bad decisions and good ones over the years. Has come under pressure at key points, especially with regards to the civilian military issue over the years. But this decision cannot be something that Islamabad wanted last week. So that's the first thing. The other thing I'll say is the fact that the Pakistani federal government has put in its joined hands with the Sindh government in appealing the Supreme Court's decision is positive. The fact that he's being moved to a safe house instead of being released is a sign that Pakistan cares about this, right? That it does not want to be seen through that singular lens. And it's unfortunate for it, frankly, that it is seen through this, but I think it's something that it can get over, right? That it's not going to be, doesn't need to be the defining feature of its relationship under the Biden administration. I'll stop there and we can go to a second round.
So Elizabeth, before I give you a chance, because you're going third, you get stuck with my addendum questions, which is, Madiha raised a good point that, that the timing suggests that this was something that was not orchestrated by the state. But the corollary is, to what extent was the Lakhdhi arrest and sentencing designed to be timed with the new Biden administration?
Yeah, reading the tea leaves of Pakistan's judiciary is always a challenge. And so I think it's important to say that up front. I, more actually than the incoming Biden administration, I would see that politically in the context of the upcoming meeting of the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, which was delayed 6 months because of COVID and will now be happening in late February. I think it's significant that Lakhdhi was charged on exactly that, terror financing. And the US has long been calling for him to be charged for his involvement in the Mumbai attacks directly. But it was 3 counts of terror financing, which is nonetheless significant, right? Like the fact that he was charged. But I think reading the US response, similar to what we have seen in the last couple of years, it's both recognizing the efforts that Pakistan has been taking, but also looking for something a little bit more permanent, kind of the sense that fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. That's perhaps not a terribly generous way of looking at it, but over the experience we've seen, as we saw in 2015 with Lakhdhi's release, I think time will tell from Washington's perspective whether that revolving door will continue. I think more broadly, though, the real challenge that I see in both of these cases is one of selective enforcement. So the certain crimes and certain charges and certain accusations are treated more seriously than others. I think it's important to recognize that a sitting member of the National Assembly, who happens to also be a leader of PTM, is behind bars for hate speech right now. And not to mention the case of Shakil Afridi, which I know is a whole other can of worms, was tried under the FCR. There are any number of issues with that case and many others that don't meet this level of scrutiny, but are also perhaps don't get the attention or the opportunities to appeal and to be heard at the level of the Supreme Court that we've seen in this case. So yes, it speaks to a certain level of independence, but I wouldn't take that so far as to suggest that, the system itself treats all defendants equally.
Excellent. Let me since we've already started straying into this territory and we're running up against the clock, let me ask a couple of concluding questions, and we'll stay with you, Elizabeth, first. Noting that you no longer are a representative of the US government, but someone who knows US policy settings intimately, let me ask you to put yourself in the shoes of the new Biden administration. And ask you, if you were sitting either at State or NSC or wherever, and you are crafting the Biden administration's policy approach to Pakistan now, 2021, how do you balance or juggle the many differing policy priorities that we have seen the Biden administration already emphasize? And so let me pose to you three policy priorities that we keep hearing about. Number one is the competition with China. Despite initial doubts, it seems that the Biden administration is going to be pretty firm on that. Number two, equally, they have repeatedly said they are going to be firm on adhering to America's values of liberalism and promotion of those values across the world. And third, what you might call emerging threats and challenges that previous US governments have not focused on to such an extent, especially climate change. How, if you are sitting in Washington, do you thread the needle between all of these differing policy priorities and come up with a coherent approach towards a Pakistan that is not just a partner of China and not just a critical actor in Afghanistan, but a country that has its own internal problems, as we've been discussing today?
Easy question. I'm going to make my load even heavier by adding in Afghanistan, because I think in terms of the policy priorities, quite frankly, that is likely to steer the ship for at least the next year or 2 years, depending on how things play out. I think regardless, fingers crossed for so many reasons, we will see increased stability in Afghanistan, but Pakistan realistically will be a partner in that, and will feel the impacts of whatever outcomes we see from Afghanistan. And I don't see a scenario in which that falls out of first place in terms of priorities in the relationship. In terms of the other three, so China, kind of liberal values / democracy, and emerging threats, I think the incoming administration, to the extent that it is able, would be wise to focus on the latter category, to focus on climate change as an area where there is both perhaps more opportunity, but also less baggage, which is so valuable in a relationship like this, especially when you have officials who have come in after having, many of them have previous experience on Pakistan, right? Have worked in prior administrations, know the issues, know the players for better and worse. So perhaps it's a useful area to just try to build some new trust in. I know Pakistan has been keen to shift from kind of a geostrategic to more of a geoeconomic frame. I think that is an admirable goal, but it's a really challenging one, both because of just the way that the US private sector works. The US can do certain things to incentivize investment, but our hands are tied in comparison to something like, what China can do in this space. And I don't think it would be wise for the incoming administration to really try to go toe to toe with China on Pakistan. I don't imagine a US-Pakistan economic corridor, for example. I think that is just, in some ways, we've tried that and it hasn't succeeded. You see, KLB and that whole experience, which is worthy of its own conversation. But instead, to the extent that Pakistan can really identify sector-specific areas where the regulatory environment is a little bit friendlier, where companies can come in and see genuine opportunities, Maybe again, that's in the green energy space, that's in the climate space. It could be on the tech side. If you can start to build up some of those areas, it could provide a little bit of ballast for the relationship that could help steady it through the inevitable ups and downs that we're likely to still see.
That was excellent. That was a really thoughtful, clear response. Thank you. Madiha?
I think Pakistan has made clear in recent weeks that it does not want to be seen in the Biden administration through an Afghanistan lens alone, right? So this is something that, it wants to be seen on its own terms. And one of the things that Pakistani officials have said is that it would be interesting, if Pakistan is to be seen in another frame, then it should be seen in the frame of being a broker in some ways with China. So, sort of a role of a bridge builder is something that Foreign Minister Qureshi said in an interview just recently, talking about the Nixon-Kissinger visit to China 4 decades ago. Right, so Pakistan, I mean, this is something that Pakistan has been doing over the last couple of years, offering itself up as a mediator, pushing that kind of mediating role on the on a global stage. Iran and Saudi Arabia, the relationship between Iran and the US, basically sort of offering itself up like that. But at the same time, Foreign Minister Qureshi also said, come invest in Pakistan, right? So the US should not see, again, something Pakistan has been saying, we don't look at the Pakistan, China, and the Pakistan-US relationship, sort of the triangle as a zero-sum triangle. The US should come invest. So it's sort of an invitation for sort of strategic competition, right? And then sort of what Pakistan has been saying is, look, we want to build a comprehensive partnership. And it wants, it's sort of, as Elizabeth pointed out, pushing that sense of economic cooperation. And of course, there are real challenges to that, right? I mean, it's something actually the Trump administration proposed, increased trade, and wasn't able to really do because, partly because it wasn't able to do, partly because a lot of the stuff that President Trump said in that meeting may have been bluster rather than something that would actually have policy intent, but also because the U.S. Frankly tried with a couple of visits and it didn't really get anywhere. But that's something I think what we have here, the opportunity here, there is a lot of baggage, and I think the baggage is going to perhaps color at least the beginning of the relationship. And the key will be to not let it affect the relationship in the longer term, and to really sort of, I think what Pakistan wants is actually a desirable thing, right? Like to look at Pakistan on its own terms. And will the Biden administration be able to do that? It is so difficult when its neighbors are China, Afghanistan, and India. It is so difficult. And all of those neighbors are more important, perhaps more immediately. But Pakistan is the 5th largest country in the world, has 220 million people. And it's a country that President Biden understands. And so, my hope is, and this would be beneficial for the US as well, right? That because then there will be more convergence in terms of how the relationship goes, as opposed to sort of a divergent path that the two countries take, while still managing an uneasy alliance. A better sort of hope for the relationship is that at some point something emerges, perhaps after the Afghan peace process, where Pakistan is looked at on its own terms, whatever those are, and the Biden administration moves on from there.
Excellent. No, I think that's definitely the place from which we were holding this webinar as well. So I think that makes a lot of sense to take Pakistan on its own terms. Last word to you, Rabia.
I would agree with mostly what both Elizabeth and Madiha said. I think, My only worry with the Biden administration is, I hope that the baggage is not, carried forward through this new relationship that both countries are trying to forge. My only worry is that the do more mantra might come back and haunt Pakistan, in especially in the Afghanistan case. If the peace process does not survive, if the intra-Afghan peace process does not have a chance, then the obvious scapegoat in all of this is going to be Pakistan. And I think Pakistan needs to start working on, how does it want to alienate itself from or preemptively, from the fallout if that happens. On China, I think Madiha has also said it. Pakistan needs to convert all its divergences into convergences with the incoming Biden administration. And why can't China, be the convergence point for both? CPIC doesn't need to be a zero-sum game. And Pakistan, with all its potential, is not a mutually exclusive domain. It is not monogamous in its approaches and relationships. That is unnatural to Pakistan. So China and US, with their strategic interest in the region, I believe can coexist in Pakistan, and through Pakistan can achieve their individualistic, strategic interests. And that would be my 2 cents on that.
Rabia, just when I think you can't get optimistic enough, you suggest a US-China compact on Pakistan, and suddenly we're on new ground. We are out of time, I'm afraid. Thank you, all three of you, so much. I promised that we would try for this hour to take Pakistan on its own terms. We couldn't quite keep Afghanistan and China out of it. We couldn't quite build that Berlin Wall. But as you all said, that would also be unnatural. But I think we gave it a fair shake to take Pakistan on its own terms. I think we've agreed that while what's happening in Pakistan is dynamic and perhaps in some extent unprecedented, 2021 is not going to be the sort of inflection point that some might hope for. But either way, there's definitely a lot to watch. And I thank you all. And with that, we conclude this webinar.